Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the EmbellishPod. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully it can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. If you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll try to get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at EmbellishPod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today, we're going to continue or begin a conversation with Angel's Envy that began a couple weeks ago, a month ago, at an event at the Louisville Water Company that was really, really fun. And I hope you guys enjoy the conversation I have with Owen today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you have to be viewing or listening to this particular podcast. This afternoon, I have Owen Martin joining me from Angel's Envy. Owen, if you would, just kind of give me the elevator speech on who you are, and you could probably do Angel's Envy real briefly. Most of the folks that watch this probably know who they are, but it never hurts to kick the brand story again.
All right. Yeah, I'm always working on the elevator pitch. I'm just seeing how short I can get it. But all right, mine is, one, I'm the master distiller for Angel's Envy, pretty much exactly 3 years in the role. And my whole career is just one pivot to the next. So engineer by degree, at least, but quickly moved to craft brewing from there. After a brief stint in beer, moved to Scotland with the intention of getting a more formal brewing education. But the program I was accepted into was a dual brewing distilling master's degree. So by nature of a couple years in Scotland, more than a few glasses of scotch, the scotch bars of Edinburgh, pivoted to whiskey from there, Scotch whiskey, obviously. But moving back to the States after that, then it's basically then been a move up from very small mom and pop craft places to progressively larger ones, both through bourbon, rye, and a stint back in single malt production before moving to Kentucky and finding my footing here.
And you kind of maybe downplayed the ascension through different things, but where you were previous to Angel's Envy was Stranahan's, and Stranahan's is pretty well known in the American single malt game. It feels like, at least from a career progression, going from Stranahan's, you could probably make a jump to a lot of different distilleries that exist. What makes Angel's Envy so interesting as far as a jump, as opposed to maybe any other and no degradation to any of them, but any other distillery that might be out there that might be looking for somebody to come on board? What made Angel's Envy sort of the interesting thing?
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually probably a good one to then hit the brand story as well as then sort of how I've integrated into that. But yeah, so Angel's Envy's been around. An original launch was supposed to be in 2010, but first bottles on the shelf early 2011, and basically has been the finished bourbon company, right, from day one. We're in a little bit different space now where pretty much everybody under the sun's got a finished whiskey or finished bourbon. But at the time that we launched, that Lincoln Henderson and his family got it off the ground, that was a pretty radical notion. So yeah, basically from day one, port finished bourbon, and then I've integrated some spirits finishes in. I've sort of moved this into some double oaked territory as well as some other finishes we hadn't previously used. But yeah, so that's kind of both my background via Scotland, right, where cask finishing has a much deeper history. And then my time at Stranahan's making a Scotch style whiskey, so that had used cask finishing since its early days as well. And basically by the end of my I guess six and a half years there, I was functioning mostly as like the blender and the product developer. And so, even though I was overseeing day-to-day production as well, the special releases are what really captured a lot of my attention and time there. And most of that was done via, sherry finishes, different spirit finishes. And so that was the parallel over to Angel's Envy when the opportunity came up. I think had we been a different bourbon, I guess, brand identity distillery, like I don't know that I would have even been considered, because obviously there's a million great candidates homegrown in Kentucky who've worked their way through both small and large distilleries. But because we, integrated a process which wasn't usual at the time, I think Angel's Envy was more open to the idea of hiring somebody with a less usual background, and one that kind of spanned craft whiskey to international whiskeys, and obviously a good deal of cask finishing involved throughout.
And if I look at the timeline of what distilleries were doing around the time that you're making this transition, American single malt's on the rise amongst a bunch of different distilleries. Cask finishing is on the rise amongst a bunch of different distilleries. So I think you may be underselling yourself, right? You probably were a valuable commodity regardless, because everyone's trying to get into the American single malt or the cask finishing game. But maybe for people that don't fully understand finishing whiskeys, right? That is core and central to the Angel's Envy brand and has been since its inception. Um, kind of give us the why it is important, what it's doing for Angel's Envy specifically. Kind of as far as a brand identity, what cask finishing benefits are we getting?
Sure. I mean, the nuts and bolts of it are taking mature whiskey, in our case, mostly bourbon, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever the amount of time in the new oak barrel is, and then disgorging those barrels. So blending a handful of those together, and then meanwhile getting empty barrels on site that had either held something else or now, might just be a new oak barrel itself as well. And then filling that with the bourbon that had already been matured. So one of our lines oftentimes is where other companies stop, we continue to progress. But again, I think most people have a cask finished whiskey out now, so I don't know that that's applicable as much. But basically, I mean, still what we do day to day at the distillery, 95% of the time is just educate on what finishing is. Because I think, again, probably better understood amongst international whiskey enthusiasts, and still, I mean, even though your bourbon nerd clearly knows what it is nowadays, your general population less so. So yeah, basically just describing that when we put that aged bourbon into a barrel that had held something else, wine, spirits, whatever that may be, that the kind of remnants of that spirit or wine is still in the wood of the barrel. So that is imparting some of its flavor, color, qualities, mouthfeel, whatever, as well as the wood in often cases of that barrel as well. So for me, it's kind of both the act of marrying those whiskeys within the barrel and kind of getting that integration of flavor, as well as then that barrel imparting its flavor too. So, I think I still encounter, and I'm sure that Lincoln and everyone in the early days, it was a dime a dozen, but people saying, oh, I'm a purist. I don't drink this. You only cask finish things that are subpar. And I think a lot of the work that I do day to day, both in terms of our releases and then when I'm doing tastings or whatever else, is showing just the intentionality behind that, right? So our base bourbon has an inherent fruity quality to it. It has some nuttiness. The wine barrels only serve to accentuate that. And then the ryes, obviously have a spice quality, earthy quality, as I'm sure most drinkers are aware. And so whether we're finishing that in our rum barrels, like our day-to-day, or some of the new releases I've done with tequila and peated scotch, it's either about accentuating that or almost contrasting against that, but never losing sight of what the base is. And so that's at least the drum that I beat day to day. So I think for us, I mean, finishing, for people to get it right, like that's kind of a production tool. But then for me as well, it's almost like a marketing thing as well, because certainly as we go down the road of becoming more of an international company or international brand, it's leaning into what the drinking habits are of any country we're launching in. And perhaps there's maybe a special release that can accompany that uses a finishing cask from that place or that, population. Again, with intentionality behind it. But that's kind of where I see the road heading.
And you said something kind of early on in the description of how you guys do your finishing process that I think is kind of one of the two factors of helping change at least the North American perspective on cask finishing bourbon, is you said mature whiskey, right? Because you sort of alluded to it, like people could say, oh, you're using it to either hide young or bad whiskey, right? That's what cask finishing is for. So tell me a little bit about what mature whiskey means in your definition of kind of a base ingredient for your cask finishing.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, what we distill, I mean, probably 99% of the time is the same base bourbon recipe. So 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% malted barley. We're actually doing some innovation grain bills through this month, which is fun. But that's our bread and butter. So, right now we're about 5 years aged for the base whiskey, which for a signature series product, which is our phrase for just our daily drivers, something that you can expect to be on the shelf today, a year from now, 5 years from now. 5 years to me is a good mark of a mature whiskey. it's not, you're not going to break the bank. You haven't lost a ton out of the barrel, but it still doesn't have any of that youth or sharpness to it, and it is a complete product in itself. And then when we talk about like special releases, if something that's going to be $150, $200 bottle, of course, I want to make sure that the quality meets that mark as well. So mature whiskey in that sense may be 8, 9, 10, 12, whatever I have at my hands. So something I've said with other interviews is, and I already said it with respect to Stranahan's, is 3 years of the company, like clearly I'm a blender to date, right? Like despite the title, nothing that I've distilled is in a bottle, and nor will it be for years to come. And so, whether it's some of the first barrels off our still in 2016, or some of our single barrels with 2018, 2019 distillate in it, or if it's sourced whiskey, right, sourced bourbon or sourced rye, these are all tools that I have at my disposal to blend the whiskey that I want to. As I mentioned, we're doing innovation grain bills this month. Some of the first things I ever set down were different fermentation trials. So like all of that's coming. It's not here yet. But I mean, I think we've made a 15-year history on cask finishing and will continue to do so. But when I have these opportunities to push us outside of our norms even, or show other sources of innovation, or maybe even in conjunction with a cask finish, like that's kind of, I think, where I'm moving us towards.
And maybe the kind of the other side of the equation on trying to understand what cask finishing means and what it is from an intentional perspective is what cask you're using to do your secondary aging in, do you do your finishing in. So I guess you've mentioned a number of different spirits that you've used for finishing, some ideas that you have. How do you approach selecting and sourcing these finishing casks, right? Because if we're going to understand, okay, we've got at least not at least, but we've got a 5-year-ish whiskey that's going to go in for additional maturation in this cask. What are you looking for, maybe in terms of, quality or flavor contribution from the finishing casks?
Sure. I mean, I would say project to project. But I guess, how do I want to address this? I guess one way I look at it is breaking it into kind of the base categories. So we've mentioned wine, spirits, and double oaking. So those are kind of the three categories that I see, at least if I'm going to generally treat a barrel that I have less experience with or no experience with. So past wine, I would even call that section like the fermented base, right? So wine, vast majority, but also beer, cider, that sort of thing. So something that has been fermented and then barrel aged. And I'm going to treat that a little bit differently in terms of where I put it in the warehouse, how long I give it, as opposed to a spirits barrel, which I'm much more comfortable saying, like, look, I'm happy to give that 2, 5, whatever, how many years, because to me it's less about, or I guess spirits being distilled, it's going to be a little bit more gentle of a character, and one that I don't need to, wrangle quite as tightly. And then the third one being like double oaking, right? So a finishing barrel, but a new barrel, and one that hasn't been filled with something. And so, toasted oak barrels, French oak barrels, double oak, that sort of thing. And I'm also going to treat that on a shorter time frame, more akin to what I would with like a wine barrel, because those ones can get very much overpowering if you give it multiple summers in the barrel. Whereas like a spirits barrel, I'm feeling pretty safe that I can give it a longer run. Again, there's always exceptions. Those are speaking in generalities, but that's kind of how I'd look for it. I mean, I guess amongst wine of how I behave day to day. We source our wine through what's called a broker, or our wine barrels through a broker. So those are companies that just buy and sell barrels. That's their whole business model. And so in that case, for like our core products, we have the spec that we give the broker, who then goes around Portugal to the different bodegas to source those port barrels to the spec that we've given them. So, just in terms of no off flavors, no sulfur or sour, that sort of thing, a certain amount of wine character imparted. You don't want to have that finishing barrel and then get very little out of it. So that's kind of how that works. And then I would say for special projects, I'm split between also working through brokers, and then I also like to work in company when I get the chance to, which we can kind of get into that. But that's definitely more in like an R&D basis for specialty products.
I guess, so you've got these barrel brokers out kind of, quote unquote, sniffing out casks for you. Do these brokers ever come across anything really unique that you're like, man, I want to get a hold of that and kind of test out? Or do you kind of build the innovation on your own and kind of tell them to go find XYZ cask?
A little bit of both. I mean, all the brokers, I always tell like, hey, anything you got, send it. Like, you send me your lists of your updated inventories. I'll take a look at them any and every time. Um, Normally, it's got to be something really special that captures my attention there. Typically, I'm trying to build it from the other direction, kind of as we discussed earlier, where it's, identifying some of the base whiskey barrels that I think are exceptional, and then sort of pulling those to the side, and then identifying what I think I can accentuate in that whiskey. And so a lot of times I already kind of know what I'm looking for. And then I'll go to ask the broker if they can go source that, or what time frame it might take them to source it, or in company for that matter. And so that's kind of how I usually do it. So I'm either building on R&D that I've done at previous distilleries or in Scotland, and then applying that here to bourbon and rye at a larger scale. And sometimes that kind of, I guess, kickstarts it, right? If I've already done the base testing, then I can kind of be a little bit more sure I can jump in the deep end here. I might go buy 100 barrels just sight unseen. Whereas if it's a new type of wine that I haven't used, a lot of times I'll do a little bit more cautious approach where I'll get 4 or 8 of those barrels. I might put bourbon into some of them, rye into some of them, some, innovation grain bills into other ones, and then let those tell me what's working or what doesn't, or maybe none of it does. But at least I've trialed that out in kind of like the small scale, and then I'll take whatever whiskey I think worked best with that new type of wine or spirit, and then go get 100 of those and scale it up. So it can, there's no one set way that we approach it. I'm a big believer that you're sort of reacting to all the variables that are scrolling across my feed, or, approaching me every day. And if I'm not reacting to those and letting those inform what we're doing, then I'm not doing my job right.
Yeah, and I wonder, you came from Stranahan's, which they do some pretty unique finishes as well. Like there's a lot of things that are going on there, and I'm sure there's still some projects that you laid down that haven't seen the light of day just yet. But you moved into what might be considered big leagues. You've got more opportunity to play with. How do you kind of keep from just try everything, right? Because I'm sure you're approached with hundreds of different options. How do you kind of narrow your focus and say, here's where we want to experiment. Here's where this is going to be core lines. Like, how do you actually do this without, having the ADHD do everything all at once version of it?
I mean, honestly, I'm probably still tackling that question every single day. I mean, I'm definitely the type to lay down a lot of things, and then, as I said, let the whiskey tell me which of those are heading the right direction. So I feel like any given month, we're probably putting down 2 or 3 new things, usually on a smaller scale, and that could be from the base grain bill side, or that could be on a finishing cast side. So it's constant, right? I mean, I think that's why I got brought on board, was to really, push the boundaries of that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the thing I got to be cognizant of is I don't want to make so many new things that people, glaze over, like it overwhelms them. So I think we've certainly moved innovation up many notches over the last few years. But I think any given market is probably only seeing hopefully a couple, 2 or 3 of those a year, and that to me still feels appropriate. But we might have a new single barrel, right, that only a few accounts to get, or our cellar, or our cask strengths. Obviously, we have some stuff now that's available distillery only. So Kentucky probably sees a lot more of it, but most other folks don't. Um, so yeah, but I mean, I think I'll go back to just, I will always let the whiskey guide me. Like, we can have, and we do, we have a 3-year plan, 5-year plan of what we think our new products are going to be. And I like having that framework, but I always want to have the ability to pivot from that framework if the whiskey's not turning out in the direction we expected it to.
Yeah, and I was having a conversation earlier today where we were talking about 5-year plans, and you set them only to revisit them every 12 months, right? Because you're
Correct.
probably not going to get them, but you got to have kind of your North Star or whatever.
Yeah.
You said when you're doing these, cask finishes that you want to kind of test out, you're doing it at a smaller scale. When you say smaller scale, you mean still full size format barrels, just not like lots
Always.
and lots of
Yeah.
barrels. Because I think smaller distilleries like Stranahan's, they may say smaller barrel is, or smaller scale is smaller barrel. You're just saying not 50 barrels, maybe
Volume.
5.
Yeah, volume. Yeah, that's a good point of clarification. And I mean, I have at Stranahan's, even we did some small barrel trials as a way to get informed a little bit more quickly, right? Your surface area, the amount of liquid you have in there, it's not going to create the same whiskey, but it'll get you an idea faster than a full size barrel. So I've actually come all the way back around, and I'm looking at I have a lot of mixed feelings about small format barrels because certainly earlier in my career I was making some younger whiskey using those. But now I'm actually doing a few little trials on finishing in small format barrels after it's been fully matured in a large format one. And I'll give credit to Scotch industry on that one as well. Like if you've heard of Lefroy quarter cask, obviously I'm not the first person to come up with that idea, but again, I think that's the type of thing where I'm looking at other industries as well to see what could be applied here. But yeah, no, I'm a firm believer we will never mature anything in a anything less than a 53-gallon barrel.
All right, so now we'll backtrack a little bit. And you mentioned this, Angel's Envy is a part of the broader Bacardi portfolio. And you want to try to stay in house with some of your opportunities. There's some finishing casks within the portfolio that you've yet to try out that you're really kind of like, I really want to try that one thing, or have you already kind of reached into those and been able to try it?
No, I mean, my general goal is to do 1 or 2 in-company trials a year, and obviously there's a little less risk there. So I mean, because again, from a dollar cost, it's lower, and I'm a little bit more sure that I can reproduce that if I need to. If the first trial doesn't go to plan, I could do a second trial and not be put out for it. So no, I got plenty of things I'm still looking to get. Mezcal, hopefully later. I guess next spring is kind of what we're thinking on that one. I want to get some Teeling is our sister distillery in Dublin, and I'd like to try out a variety of their products. So that one would be more of like we were talking about, where maybe I get 3 different Teeling products. I get our bourbon, our rye, even some other ones lined up, and then I almost grid the whole thing out and just see what works with what doesn't, and then kind of take that and scale from there. So yeah, we have email threads on both of those topics going. So I guess a few years from now, maybe anyone listening to this, if you see something on the shelf there, you can say, I heard it here first.
So in aging, at least for what you guys are doing, is not just spirits at this point, right? And so I was lucky enough to attend an event that you guys held at the Louisville Water Company where you talked about a water aging project, right? And that was a fantastic event. And it was incredibly surprising kind of what came out the other end of it. But for people who weren't there, who aren't aware of this, kind of tell me about that project and what led you to try that in the first place.
Sure. Well, I'll take that back to, well, so we did 2 different ones, right? So I know which one you're talking about. You're talking about the barrel aged one, but we just, I guess for a little context there, we did a double release just about a month ago for our next round of distillery only ones, and certainly the role I've kind of worked myself into is coming from more of a pure production background, but now I span a little bit into marketing to the point where I'm actively trying to think of the story that I'm telling around the whiskey as I'm developing the whiskey itself. And so in this case, the double release, the kind of story that I wanted to tell was hyper local versus more internationally inspired. And so the hyper local one, we had an innovation grain bill. So the first time we've put that in a bottle for people. So that was 90% corn, 10% malted barley. So we called it our 2-grain bourbon. So again, the 90% corn, all locally sourced. So it was our really first opportunity to kind of play the terroir game. Mostly when we're sourcing finishing casks, we're not talking about the provenance of that because it's not here. And so we've never had that local angle. So 90% local corn. And then as I dug deeper into it, found all the barrels were made in Louisville, so from a cooper's called Kelvin. And so that was the first time we kind of kicked off the idea of closing the loop there with water and hitting local on all 3 levels. So we partnered with Louisville Water Company and pulled some specific, they have a trademark on their tap water, so it's called Louisville Pure Tap, and so we did the last cut with that. But to get to your question, then the second release of that was the internationally inspired one. So we took some rye whiskey, so we want to have a bourbon and a rye. The rye was Kentucky, but after that we finished it in peated Scotch barrels. So clearly a very international cask there, a different flavor profile than what you normally find in Louisville. But then to hit that on a second level as well, we took a inspiration from the cognac industry, who does a little bit different cutting. They'll do a lot of cutting in barrel. So like as they experience angel share, they actually top it up with water and gradually bring the proof down, and they do some barrel aging of their water. And so that's kind of what I wanted to look at to, again, kind of flesh out the idea of if I'm going to do local on 3 different levels, let's do international on a couple as well. To fully, be transparent, that was more of a happy accident of that part of it. So around August of last year of 2024, I'd emptied some rye barrels and I put a small amount of water in there. Again, thinking of the cognac industry, thinking of kind of like, I guess in American terms, more of devil's cut, right? That's trademark from a different company, so I don't want to use it. But the idea that you more rinse the last bit of alcohol that's left in the wood out of the barrel and then reuse that. So I'd planned on only putting water in there for a few weeks, probably, 4 weeks, month and a half, something like that, and just seeing what came out of it. But there was a miscommunication with our warehouse team, and almost all our barrels go straight to Scotland after their first use, the bourbon barrels and rye barrels. And so I had thought they'd mistakenly been shipped to Scotland with a few gallons of water in them, and, off they were. So it didn't end up using that idea in the next project that I thought it could have been used for. But in April of this earlier this year of 2025, then I got a text it was a picture of these 50 barrels that had just been sat kind of in a lonely little rick by themselves that said "Save for Owen," and no one knew what they were. And it took me a second to place it. And I was like, "Oh shit, those are the water barrels." And instead of 4 weeks time, they'd been aged for 10 months. So I was expecting not much, either they were bone dry at that point, or maybe whatever water we dumped out of them just tasted like, twigs and sawdust. And what came out of them was one of the most surprising things I think I've seen in my entire career. Not oaky at all. Well, first of all, 30% ABV. Maybe I should say that first. Again, remember, we put about 5 gallons of water into each. I think by the time we dumped them, we were hitting more like 1 or 2. So not exactly a scalable or hugely reproducible idea, but something that I think is insane. So 30% ABV, like the best descriptor I've had is almost like a lemon tart, like this crazy creaminess, but then also these bright, fruity, citrus, tropical characters. So like, that water can estrify, can pull out some of these, sweeter and fruitier compounds and then mature those with oxidation. And that's exactly what happened with that. So I think knowing that the next rye release that we had up was the peated one, and then it sort of just fit into that narrative so perfectly. And again, not fully intentionally, as much as it pains me to say it. But that creamy, that tropical, that citrus, to me, actually really like added a degree of approachability to it. Whereas the peat itself was pretty aggressive, and that tempered it into a little bit more well-rounded release, and I think really made it what it was. So, we're looking at it, and I'm like, well, again, like I said, not exactly an easy thing to reproduce, but something that I think you will see us use again. I'm not exactly sure what that application will be, but we're continuing to look at it, and I think what was coming out of those barrels was too cool not to share with people. I think you were lucky that we had it at the press release, because again, I was so excited by it. I almost wanted to talk about that as much as the releases themselves. But more to come. How about I'll leave it at that?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Because we went in expecting to taste these two things, the 2 grain and the peated, and those are phenomenal on their own. And then you kind of pulled out this water, and it was like, all right, now I am completely distracted by this barrel aged water that's at 30%. And a lot of us ended up talking about that for quite some time. So it was a really incredible and unique thing to talk about. Now, kind of leaning back into the 2 grain, you mentioned innovation grain bills and that you're actually running some innovation grain bills. Tell me a little bit about what innovation grain bill means and what you guys are doing with it.
Sure. So yeah, as I said, 72, 18, 10 is our daily driver. That's a grain bill that's been around, that Lincoln Henderson brought or ideated and brought from his Brown-Forman days to Angel's Envy, and then applied cask finishing to. So one that you definitely see around even outside of this company at other very well-known bourbon distilleries. I would say it's a pretty classic grain bill at this point. And so some of the things we're doing innovation-wise is looking at substituting that 18% rye. So that's called the small grain, right? You hear wheated bourbons, high rye bourbons, substituting that out for other small grains or other, more innovative grains, as well as just other whiskeys altogether, right? So some different rye whiskey trials, some different malt trials with different kilning and roasts. So again, just I mean, I'm sure your listeners have a pretty good degree of education, but certainly when I'm going abroad and people don't have as much experience with bourbon, I always kind of use the bread analogy of like, look, if you haven't had a specific type of whiskey, think about a bread made from that grain. So if you haven't had much bourbon, but maybe you've had cornbread, or if you haven't had rye whiskey, like think about like a Reuben and the kind of dry, snappy, spicy character of that bread. And I found that that's usually a pretty good analogy just from a basic sensory level. So again, I say 15 years on, we've made our whole name on cask finishing mostly the same type of bourbon and grain bill that I think as we look to differentiate in a marketplace where cask finishing is ubiquitous now, how do we continue to show a different degree of application and intentionality behind it? And that's where I kind of look at grain bills both for potential use in unfinished whiskey, right, as we're starting to showcase, and grain bills that I want to show people that we came up with a grain bill already with a pretty good idea of what finishing cask it was going to be in. And I think that's the stuff that I'm really excited to show people, a handful of years down the line.
And I think, the first 10 years to sort of solidify what Angel's Envy is pretty good, and starting to explore out into other grains. I guess, are there small grains that you want to explore or have explored recently that you can share? They're kind of outside the norm, or are those kind of we're going to keep that close to the chest until we're ready to release?
I mean, I play it pretty open, which hopefully you got from the last press release. I mean, to most distinctly answer your question, I've never used oats in my entire career, and I like the idea of that. I'll give credit to New Riff of being early in on that, and I think their winter whiskey that uses it is phenomenal. Um, it's interesting. So like, right now we're doing some things, but basically taking existing ingredients we have and recombining them in different ratios. When we do something with an entirely new ingredient, then I gotta have to vet that all the way through safety and quality and everything else. So, we've never done a wheated grain bill. We've always done rye. I think that's something I'm looking at maybe more for next year. Again, trying to see how we can maybe do it in a way that feels authentic and natural to us. That's not just doing something new to do it or doing something the exact way everybody else is doing it. But as a guy who has both a background in beer and in single malt, you might imagine that a lot of my experience has been with different malted barley varietals and kilning levels. So we've laid down a little bit of that as well with different caramelized malts, kiln malts, that sort of thing. So I think that's the type of stuff you'll see some more beer inspired things coming in the next couple of years.
I always love to hear beer inspired things, because I think at least a lot of us have been around for a while. We were here when the craft beer boom hit in the late '90s, mid '90s, or whatever, and so we just kind of fell straight into whiskey right after that,
Sure.
because it was an easy transition for us. But I wonder, you're talking about some different malted options, and there's a lot of other folks that are kind of exploring different corn varieties or different rye varieties. Is that a thing that you guys are doing as well, or are y'all kind of sticking with the corn and the rye that you already have?
Yeah, we have not to date. It's certainly something. I'm a big believer that we shouldn't be the ones closing the doors on anything for us to do. So I'm very open to that, but I think there's other things that I'm looking at more immediately. I mean, I'll give you one. It's not a new corn varietal, but our warehouses are about 45 minutes from here in Henry County. So basically halfway between Louisville and Cincinnati. And I think rather than look at least not off the bat, looking at completely new corn varieties, we're looking at more locally grown or specifically grown plots of corn from the land that we have our warehouses on. So, do I expect that to have a radically different flavor? No. But we've changed the grain bill a little bit in some of our trials with that to accentuate that component. So I think, again, this is still several years off. I have to stress this. I do in most of my tastings, again, back to the kind of the blender versus distiller talk. There's basically two routes to product development for us specifically is the blending route. And that's me doing exactly what I've been doing and taking extra aged whiskey. Obviously we just released a 10-year-old. So taking extra aged whiskey, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus years old, pairing that with a finishing cask, kind of the R&D that we'd mentioned. And doing that, I can have a new product out in a year. I can have an age stated 15-year-old product out in a year if I wanted to. And so that's a much shorter time frame, right? You've done all your aging on the front end before I even walked in the door. But then the second product development track, when we talk about new grains, new yeasts, new ways of running the still, That's a much slower one because we're starting from day one on that. And so it's two parallel tracks, and that's kind of what I keep hinting at. They've only really seen the first shoe drop, and that second stuff's coming. But it is a much longer cycle to get there. So anyway, I mean, even by the time some of those hit the bottle, then we'll be much further down that track and maybe have moved into more heritage varieties of that sort of thing. Um, I think I also just don't want to clutter a release up too much. Like even talking about the three local aspects of the 2 grain and the two international ones of the peated, that's really only for like a super niche audience. People that I speak to a lot in kind of the nerdier communities, probably some degree of your listeners, but I have to be cognizant that is going to be lost on a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Same if I start talking about, a heritage variety with this cask finish and this other thing I did. So, I'm always trying to think about how do I distill this down, no pun intended, to like what's the clearest elevator pitch I can say, and one that'll get across to maybe somebody who doesn't even know what cask finishing is. So there has to be a nugget there that I can say that captures someone's attention relatively quickly, or a lot of times they've probably moved on to the next thing already.
And it feels like you've entered this brand that someone else had written and completed the first act of the brand, right? And they had planned the second act, and now you're trying to kind of translate their second act into your kind of vision of it, while also writing the third act of what's going to happen next, which is just a nightmare, right? Because you're trying to figure out somebody else's vision and hone it in a direction you want to go. Kudos to you. And you're exactly right. Grain variety is something for the nerds. You could probably back down into enthusiasts just with age statements, right? That's enough to get just generic enthusiasts kind of involved. And you mentioned through the course of that you could release a 15-year, right? The ages are kind of getting there.
Yeah.
But you guys are just now not just now, but you're putting out a 10-year offering.
That's just happening. We're just entering that stage of our lifespan. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would it take for you to feel comfortable putting a 15-year age statement out, right? I guess what's preventing you from doing it right now if you already have a 10?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is I don't have that many barrels of that age in our inventory. And so I'm always, even if I have the coolest thing to show off, is it worth, having a whole label development team work on this, developing a new package, a bespoke bottle, right? Because something that's up in that age is going to need something like that to be showcased. So I think what's stopping me from doing that now is just time, right? Like I have these older components, and those will be integrated in the right products as those come up. But really, it's just time. Our distillery's only had barrels coming off the still since fall of 2016. The oldest barrels just turned 9 years old. So like as we move, and we're just in this process, of moving into our own stock across the board. When we talk about our flagship port finish bourbon and we talk about triple oak, that's pretty much all our own distillate at this point, which is great to show off because again, we're talking about 5-year-old base bourbon with around 6 months finishing time. So clearly that's all within the realm of the time span we've been making whiskey. But, we just talked about coming out with a 10-year-old. Clearly none of our own barrels are 10, like if you do that math. So, I think that release that just came out last week is really meant to tee up what's to come after that. And I think that's showcasing our own whiskeys as they come of age as well. Again, going back to the blending conversation, like when I have these older barrels, I will use them as I need to create the releases that I want to, and I want to be transparent about that. But I mean, the end goal is to get to where we're showcasing our own whiskey, right? I think that should be any distilleries, like, you take the pride is putting it in that. The craftsmanship is using all the barrels that I have at my disposal. So, So yeah, and I've probably even said this to you last time. I mean, I think one of the strengths of Angel's Envy is that the brand identity outpaces the actual history of the brand. People think we've been around for decades and decades, and we're literally just hitting 15 now. So I think for a distiller with that short of a history, to be honest, we've accomplished a lot, and it really has laid the groundwork to spring into the next era, as you mentioned. So yes, but I do find myself having to constantly live in the past, present, and future, and so it can be a little jarring at times to hop back and forth constantly.
Yeah, it's incredibly disorienting trying to work that way, and it makes a ton of sense, right? That you're kind of waging this internal war dialogue of sourced barrels versus things that you guys have produced yourself, right? That 9 year versus 10. Are you carrying around similarly aged core stock that would have been primary, a few years ago, and
Hmm.
measuring it against what you guys actually distilled? Because I know a lot of distilleries, as they come online, the first year of distillation is not always as good a quality as a
Yeah.
second year. Second
Yeah.
year's, third year, you kind of build your quality over the first 3 or 4-ish years. I guess some of that early stuff, how is that measuring up against the stuff you had sourced versus some of the later stuff, or are you guys even looking at that?
No, definitely we are. I think it was cool. So, last year's last year's cask strength release, came out just about this time last year, was about 70% our own distillate because it wasn't age stated. So it was a blend of, I want to say, 7 to 12-year-old barrels. And obviously a majority of that was our own. And a lot of that was the early stuff. I wouldn't say it's better or worse, but it's just different. I mean, I think that's the point you're maybe getting to is the early days, and it's not for me to speak to because I wasn't here, but having been at other places during early days in their production, that's a lot more tweaking, right? And reacting to what you're starting to see and then changing things. So I think the 2016 stuff is a lot more variable. I mean, a lot of it, there's some over oaked portions of it that I think were in, if I had to guess at high parts of rick houses early on before they made their way back to our palletized warehouses. But some of it is gorgeous, like super fruity, super floral. And so then I think there's not much, I think there's single digit barrels from 2017, and then 2018 is really when you get into our main stock that starts to, get to be of an appreciable value or sorry, volume. In 2018, I think hits more it feels a little bit more cohesive, has a little bit more nuttiness to it, a little bit more depth. Whereas, the good ones from 2016 are lights out, and there's some bad ones from 2016. But again, I'm almost blending when I use those. I'm using those as like the oak portion of a blend, because they are so woody. So to me, they still have value there. It's more in a component basis than being showcased as its own thing.
Yeah, and when you say bad, you're really not talking about a faulted whiskey. You're talking about something that has one central flavor that maybe you don't want, that is kind of
Yeah.
overbearing in comparison, right?
It is
That's
not a fully rounded release. It definitely skews in one direction or another, and we have
it's
that happen from
yeah.
when we pull stuff at the bottom of our warehouses as well. They tend to be a little bit more, I guess, cereal forward is probably the kindest way to put it, but they can be a little more youthful, a little bit more distillate. And so again, it's just, the job as a blending department is to take all the variables across all the products, both base bourbon, warehouse location, finishing cask, and then blend to a standard profile every single day.
Yeah, I often think about blending an awful lot like the actual container of baking spice, right? Baking spice is a number of different spices put together to create a centralized flavor profile that you sort of want, but you're not really looking for one to sort of overpower the other. And if you put them on their own, they
Yeah.
sort of do that. So I wonder, what what do you think the next what do you want the next act to be, right? So if you're thinking about, the act 3 and all of the different experiments that you're doing and all of this other stuff, right? You have to have kind of a core identity, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, whatever it is. What do what does Owen Martin's stamp on Angel's Envy look like?
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's a big question. Yeah, I think, hmm, I think it's, I keep saying the word intentional, but like we did the Ball and Bond release a little over a year ago, summer 2024, and again that was definitely us stepping outside of our own wheelhouse, our first ever unfinished bourbon. Now that has been scaled up to a national release because of the really positive feedback that we got on it, and I think will continue to be. What cadence it comes out, I don't know quite yet, but I think it's showcasing that we're going to, in the same way that I'm scaling up small barrel trials in our warehouses. That's the distillery is our place to trial new ideas. The 2 grain and the peated being the next kind of chapter in that too. But nothing says that we need to scale every single one of those up to then be a national release. So I think showing the intention behind trialing it at the distillery, getting that feedback, and then pivoting it to wherever it makes the most sense, or maybe not at all. So like the peated, the one we just described earlier, I would love to get that into travel retail, right? Get that in the hands of the people that drink peated whiskey, and then bring them into the fold of Angel's Envy and of Kentucky bourbon and whiskey. And I love the idea of just having that peated release right next to our flagship, right? Or right next to triple oak. And then that way they can take that, find a common flavor that they jive with, that they understand, and then hopefully ride that back into our core range and find, more that they maybe wouldn't have had, commonalities with to begin with, but now are more open to picking up the bottle. And, I'll give Teeling, our sister distillery, credit for that as well. I think they do as well as anybody. They did like what was it? I think it might have been their pot still finished in Duvel, Belgian beer barrels, and then launched it only in Belgium. And I think that type of idea, I don't know that we need to be that specific, but just showing that, I think if I was hired because of global experience, if we were already applying more of a global whiskey concept to bourbon, let's continue to do that, right? If that's our strength, if that's our skill set, but let's take that and be mindful of that and with how we then launch it around. And then I think in the States, I mean, again, 15 years in, it felt like it was the right time for us to release a straight bourbon, a bottle and bond. And so I think even finding where the white spaces are in our own sort of structure that we've established and then pinpointing those, right? I don't think we ever want to get comfortable with what we've done so far. It's like keep finding what makes us uncomfortable and certainly what's the white spaces in our portfolio and then try it, right? Because now we can try it at the distillery. Even if we don't think it's going to be a smashing success, try it at the distillery. And then we've at least gotten feedback on it. I've gotten feedback because I've now made that whiskey, and now I'm actively getting feedback from consumers every day at the distillery. So, I don't know if that's the longest vision or the most specific thing I could have told you, but I think that maybe encompasses what I want to continue, or I think what we've been doing and what we will continue to do.
And I'll say it feels like there are a lot of heritage distilleries that have international only releases, and it makes a ton of sense to take something like a peated cask and push that into European markets, because European palates are incredibly different than American palates. And even within Europe, there are, kind of micro areas of different flavor profiles that make sense to different people. I mean, culinarily, you can just think about, food in Italy versus France versus United Kingdom. They're all very different, and people that live there like those different things. So,
Right.
I guess thinking about Angel's Envy as more of a global brand at this point, right? Kind of maybe it tips its hat to being a part of the Bacardi portfolio, which is a multinational corporation. Are there some things that beyond the peated cask that you would like to do that would be focusing on European palates or palates anywhere else that might not necessarily just hit home here in the United States with everyone?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we already do it a little bit, right? Like I again come keep broken record, keep saying come from Scotch world, right? So I'm not the type of kind of bourbon consumer that's chasing the hazmat stuff all the time. I recognize that is a portion of the consumer base and one that I want to find the right releases for, but it's not how I'm going to shape every single one of our releases. I'm oftentimes thinking about what I'm pouring for my family at the holidays, right? Or my friends that don't know really a whole lot about bourbon, but want to see what's going on. And if I'm pouring them something 140 proof, I don't know how well that's going to be received. That being said, I mean, our cask strength that we just released last week is 122.6. So like that, I would say, even with the cask finishing, is much more for an American bourbon audience that wants that higher proof expression. And frankly, I think may be lost on a lot of like European, Japanese, Australian palates. But like our cellar release series typically falls more in the 100 to 110 range. That Extra Añejo rye we just did, Extra Añejo finished rye back in May, I think kind of fell in that, right? That one, I think in that 100 to 110 range can qualify both as that kind of happy middle ground where you're bourbon enthusiast. It's a high enough proof that it shows that you haven't diluted it down, to past where they want it. And then meanwhile, it still has a degree of approachability that I think somebody who's less accustomed to drinking cask strength, barrel proof stuff, it can still enjoy. So, exactly. Like, so our cellars of that range may be pivoted more internationally here and there, whereas a cask strength maybe either goes to a more tried and true bourbon market like Japan, or just stays mostly domestic. So I think there's already a little bit of that afoot. And then just kind of how I was describing with the different finishing casks that maybe are more accustomed to or known in those individual spaces, and finding what whiskeys in my inventory feel like they fit together nicely in that.
Yeah, and and I know we're pushing up on time a little bit here. Probably should take a little bit of time and talk about the most recent release, the 10-year that you guys are pushing out, and do you have anything else planned? As we go into October, November, December, a lot of times there are seasonal releases that come out because it's the end of the year and that's when things happen. So tell me a little bit about what's happening for the next few months, including the most recent release.
Yeah. So the cast strength came out, just a week ago, less than a week ago. And so we're calling our cast strength 10 or our Angels Envy 10. So it's the first ever age stated, not only cast strength, but first ever age stated Angels Envy. And the thought process there was it's the 14th year of our cast strength, dating back to 2012. And so how do we kind of keep the conversation going there, especially as we mentioned, start to kind of grow up in our history as a brand. What you won't see it's not called a 10-year bourbon, and that was specific. I really wanted to showcase if we were going to age state something as a company that has always hung its hat on cask finishing, that should be part of that story. And so the 10 refers to cumulative time in both the bourbon barrel and the port barrel. But that means we can't, if we put the 10 directly in front of the word bourbon or straight bourbon or Kentucky straight bourbon, then that does legally signify 10 years in new oak, which was not the case with this. So it's a blend of some 7-year bourbon with a 3-year finishing time, some 9-year bourbon with a 1-year finishing time, some nine and a half with enough to get it past the 10-year mark. So basically each of the components crosses that 10-year threshold. And so that's the kind of conversation that I want to have around that, especially in an age where a lot of age statements are coming back or increasing, to still show that we're doing that a little bit in our own way. So anyway, initial feedback's been very positive from everyone, and we're just kind of getting it going. Again, just launched last Friday. Let's see. We got some higher end single barrels that I think you'll start seeing popping up around the country. Nothing crazy. We just had basically our 100 best accounts, our longest standing accounts. Like Benny's out of Chicago and those sort of ones that we wanted to offer something a little bit more special. Again, not too much different. We use Tawny Port instead of Ruby Port.
Mm-hmm.
We did one of those at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival last month as well, and it was pretty well received. And then, like I said, the national release of the Bottle and Bond. So I think that was pretty cool. Again, as a distillery release, it had been 29 barrel batch, was batch 1. I think all the batches fell in the mid high 20s. And this last one was 375 barrels. So definitely up an order of magnitude. And, as a product developer, as a blender, you always worry that if you scale something, you're going to, as you inherently can't have as high a touch on it, that you're going to lose some of that quality. But I, in complete honesty, can say that I think this national release has been our best yet. And I think we're getting the feedback on that as well. So, and honestly, and even to the last question, I think that one, because I think the youngest stuff was 5 years, 10 months. It's just super soft, right? So low entry proof, 103 entry proof. And then we put it in the coolest, most humid parts of our warehouse. So we were able to kind of get that cast strength, basically hit that 100 within that legal spec. And to me, I think a European drinker or drinker of European whiskeys will actually find a lot to like about it, because it's not over oaked at all because of the low entry proof and the very gentle maturation it had. So, and I mean, again, just with a lot of bottle and bonds being out there, just showcasing how ours, is a little bit different, but has a high degree of craftsmanship applied to it.
Yeah. And I'll say, being able to put out age statements don't mean everything, right? There are a lot of people that kind of freak out over age statements, 10 years, 7 years, 9 years, whatever kind of their flavor profile. What it does mark is it marks a company for being able to produce quality for a significant period of time, right? If you can put out a 10-year age statement, and in your way of doing a 10-year age statement, which is fantastic because it's true to brand, just says, hey, we've been doing this for longer than 10 years, right? Because you can't do that in the first year of the 10-year, release, right? Because it's not going to always be the best stuff that's out there. So, kudos to you, Owen, kind of picking up the mantle of, an important brand in bourbon and whiskey in the United States, kind of, beginning the conversation on cask finishing and what that means to us as a marketplace, kind of opening the doors for a lot of other brands, but also you guys are still doing phenomenal work. And Want to thank you for hopping on and having this conversation. We're kind of right at the edge of our time, and you can't make more time. You've got things that you could be doing that probably would make the brand money as opposed to just chit-chatting with me on a Monday afternoon. So thank
It
you
can
so
be
much for
both.
hopping on.
It can be both. Yeah. But no, it's
Yeah,
been a pleasure to be on. We'll do it again sometime. I'm actually, I'll tell you what I'm doing is I'm hopping off this. I'm going to start blending on next year's cask, which goes back to what we were talking about. You live in the past, present, and future.
right.
So literally launching this year's cask last Friday, and even last Friday in between some events there, I was going back to our blending office and getting next year's going. So uh, a good
Well, I
illustration.
want to let you get back to the good work then, right? The things that are going to
Yeah.
give us the top quality release next year. So, Owen, thanks for hopping on.
Yeah. Like I said, we'll do it again sometime. Thanks for having me, John.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform you have to be consuming this on. Leave a comment if at all possible. Hit me up on social media on TikTok or Instagram using @EmbellishPod, and you can give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can also be found at www.embellishpod.com with all my links, accounts, and contact details. Thanks for stopping by.